Baruch Hashem, today is day number 73 in our daily study of Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos. This corresponds to the 3 chapters a day of Mishnah Torah, chapters 11, 12, and 13 of Hilchos Ishus, the laws of holy matrimony, marriage, kiddushin, which means holiness. Our mitzvah today is the same mitzvah that we had yesterday, so I'll repeat it again. Negative Commandment 355, the prohibition against engaging in intimate relations outside of marriage. I'll offer you an insight that is found in the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos. Yesterday I mentioned, and I'm not going to repeat exactly what I said yesterday, but I mentioned that the Rambam explains that a person might erroneously conclude that since the penalty for engaging in a non-consensual act is a monetary fine, so that must mean that if you want to make it consensual and just pay for it in advance, then that's fine. And so the Torah says very clearly, no, there shall not be a prostitute. There shall not be a commercialization of this act. And that is the scriptural source for the prohibition against intimate relations outside of marriage. There is a sister verse, so to speak, for the verse that we mentioned yesterday. Yesterday we learned that the verse Dvarim Chav Gimel Yud Ches, which is Deuteronomy 23:18. But there's a similar verse in Vayikra, in the book of Leviticus, Yud Tes Chav Tes, chapter 19, verse 29. Al Tichalel Es Bitcha Las Neisa. It's a commandment to a father not to prostitute his daughter. Umala haaretz zima. The verse finishes, and if he'll do so, lest the outcome be that the land become full of lewdness, become full of promiscuity. So the Rambam seizes upon those words. Why does it say, and the world will become full of promiscuity? So he says like this, and if you remember, we spoke about this yesterday, that there on the books, so to speak, is already outlawed certain types of non-consensual acts. Either the most overt form of a non-consensual act, what we would describe as assault, or what we, in our clumsy translation, might call a seduction, where someone who was unwilling was convinced, so to speak, to be willing, but Torah forbids it and levies a fine against it. So that's one prohibition. But we need this extra prohibition to prohibit consensual intimate relations outside of marriage for a different reason. And when I say consensual, I mean either when it is done commercially or it's done just by two parties who decide to do so for free. Why is this separate prohibition required? And why is it specifically described in its scriptural origins as something that's done to prevent umala haaretz zima, the land, from becoming full of promiscuity? He makes a distinction between these two types of prohibitions. The non-consensual acts, although they do occur, unfortunately, they don't occur so often. This is what the Rambam says. They're not so common. However, consensual acts of lewdness is something that if we don't control it, if people aren't careful about it, it can get way out of hand and it can become widespread. It can take over society, and then the land becomes full of lewdness. So it's very interesting, this insight that the Rambam is giving, that the prohibition against assault, it's dealing with an aspect of human nature which unfortunately does exist and has to be addressed, but it's not something that threatens to take over society. It's not something that would just become normalized. But consensual acts of licentious behavior, that needs to be very carefully controlled, or it would just become the norm. So it's a very interesting insight there. And I'm not going to editorialize, but I'll invite you to contemplate what it might suggest about the society at large in which we live today. It's just a fascinating thought, but I'll leave it to you to discuss with your friends and your study partners, and that's all I'll say about that. But it's just it's food for thought. Okay, we'll continue studying tomorrow. We'll see you, God willing, then.